Dr. Bloodmoney, or How We Got Along After the Bomb by Philip K. Dick. So this book came out in 1965, and this is the original, world's first. It went straight to paperback, so this Ace paperback here is the very first time this thing ever came out. It has some very interesting cover art by Jack Gaughan there. And I also have a later Ace reprint of this one as well. And as far as I can tell, this one has pretty much stayed in print. There's an SF Masterworks edition of it. If you saw the thumbnail I used for this video, that's the artwork for the Masterworks edition, which I think is fantastic, especially for a kind of more modern book. And when I broke this book out a while ago in a book haul, there's a longtime viewer and commenter on the channel named Seth, and he mentioned that this is actually one of his favorite PKD novels. He said it was a post-apocalyptic tale, and it really intrigued my interest. And so I got around to reading it, and I gotta say, this is one of my favorite PKD novels I've read now. It is very wild, very bizarre. It's kind of PKD's kind of more on the weirder side of his stuff. It's post-apocalyptic, but a lot of what I read in that subgenre is very realistic in how the catastrophe unfolds, and then how the people are dealing with this, the aftermath of this. I would say this one has a fairly plausible catastrophe, but what happens afterwards is a little bit more implausible, but yet it's still like wildly entertaining. It's really a book that deals with some very interesting characters, maybe a bit over the top at time, maybe some caricatures of themselves, but the kind of subtle, witty humor, sometimes it's on the darker side, some like gallows humor, but most of the humor just comes between this like wild interplay between all these zany characters, and it was super entertaining. He goes places you wouldn't expect. If you're used to Philip K. Dick, you know you're going to get some of that. There's some just wild concepts, wild ideas that you probably won't forget anytime soon. So if you watch my channel and you haven't read this one, I highly recommend this book. It's a very fun ride, as long as you're into the kind of weirder side of Philip K. Dick. But I'm just going to kind of go in, give you a little bit of the setup of this one, talk about some of the characters you meet in the beginning. I will mention a character that kind of comes up later in the novel because it's kind of important and interesting. But I'm going to leave it as spoiler-free as I can because I really want people to go check this one out if you haven't already. So in the beginning of the novel, we're introduced to some characters, and there really is no main character in this one. It bounces all between many different characters throughout the whole length of the novel. And most of the novel takes place around the Bay Area of Northern California. There's one exception I'll talk about in a minute. But we're introduced to this guy named Stuart, and he works at a TV shop, and he sells TVs. And he's kind of just doing his thing, and he notices some guy that looks familiar going into a psychiatrist's office right across the street from where he works. And he later realizes that he did recognize this guy, and it turns out he's this guy named Bruno Bluthgeld, which Bluthgeld is German for blood money. So there we get the title of this one, Dr. Bloodmoney. And it turns out this guy, Bluthgeld, was a scientist who was working on this weapons program, and there was a bit of a accident, or we don't know exactly what happened, and this happened years ago, but some weapons went off, some nuclear weapons, but it kind of stayed up in the upper atmosphere, so there wasn't a lot of like annihilation on the ground or anything like that. But it does seem like some of the fallout from this is been slowly drifting down to the planet's surface. So there could be some mutations happening because of this. There could be some weirdness that's going to happen from this. And our guy Bluthgeld here, he has a lot of guilt over this. He thinks he was the main contributor, and he's seeing this psychiatrist because he doesn't know how to deal with this guilt. Now, we find out that there's another character. Her name is Bonnie Keller, and she worked with Bluthgeld, and she was somehow involved in this research for this weapons program. And she's friends with him, and she's the one that kind of convinced him to go see a psychiatrist. She's also kind of helping to protect his identity. He doesn't want to be found out. He's in this small town where he doesn't think anybody knows him, so that he can get this help. Okay, so that's one thing. And our TV salesman, Stuart, there's a couple other things that happen around him in the beginning of this one. So there's this kid in town named Hoppy Harrington, one of the most memorable characters I've read in a long time in any novel. And he's got this condition called phocomelia, is I believe how it's pronounced. You can look it up. And he basically doesn't really have any arms or legs, and he rides around in this cart that helps him do things. It's got some kind of, mechanical arms so he can still kind of function. And it rolls around town, and the whole town knows about this kid. He's the town folk like him, but there's just some oddity around this kid. He ends up getting a job at the TV shop as well in the repair department down in the basement. And he seems to be kind of like a whiz kid. He can repair all this equipment almost better than these veterans in the repair shop can. And so there's that going on. And then there's also this very historic rocket launch getting ready to happen, where the U.S. is going to send up the first people to go start a colony on Mars, but they're only going to send up this couple, and they're called the Dangerfields. That's their last name. And so it's a man and wife. They're going to send this rocket up. It's going to orbit around Earth a couple times and then slingshot out to Mars, and they're going to get established kind of like the first Mars settlement, and then eventually try to get some other people to go up to Mars. And so there's a bunch of people hanging out in front of the TV shop, just watching the TV and seeing this historic launch happen. And all this is kind of happening in the very beginning of the novel. And just to show you how kind of weird this one gets, there's a scene where Stuart, he goes out to lunch and he goes into this diner and he sees Hoppy Harrington, this kid with no arms and no legs. And he's in there eating, and he's got kind of a little crowd around him, and he's kind of talking about all kinds of stuff, kind of creating a little commotion. And Stuart's like kind of trying to ignore this, but it becomes kind of a big scene. And what Hoppy Harrington, he wants a beer, and Stuart goes over and says, "You work at the TV shop now. You're not allowed to drink. Our boss doesn't allow us to drink and come back to work." And Hoppy's like, I can do whatever I want. No one tells me that. And people are like, "Are you even 21? And he convinces the cook to go get him a beer. And obviously he's done this before because, the wait staff and the cook, everybody knows this. And they're like, "Yeah, we want to see this again." And so what happens is when Hoppy drinks a beer, he kind of goes into this weird trance, and he can kind of like foresee the future in a way, or that's what everyone thinks is happening. And so he basically describes a weird scene like this, and he's very disoriented while he's doing this, and Stuart's there witnessing this for the first time, and Hoppy Harrington tells him, he goes, "I see you, Stuart, you're eating a rat." And he's very clear to tell Stuart, "You didn't even cook the rat. This is a raw rat that you're eating." And Stuart's thinking like, what kind of future could happen where I'm eating like a raw rat? Okay, so that's kind of the main setup of this one. And then something happens. There's a major catastrophe. These nuclear weapons that went off years ago and just kind of remained up in the atmosphere. Now we get a real catastrophe. The bombs drop. This is no spoiler because, the subline of this one is how we got along after the bomb. We know there's going to be a major catastrophe. A lot of people are going to die. You know, a big amount of the population perishes in this major catastrophe. And then the rest of the novel is kind of the characters that are left all around the Bay Area, kind of dealing with this and dealing with mutation, dealing with the trying to rebuild civilization in some ways and abandoning it in other ways. Now, I said there was one exception to this taking place around the Bay Area, and that's our couple that went up in, they were going to colonize Mars. Well, something happened to her, so she dies, but Walt Dangerfield, he's left, and he's just left orbiting the planet. And he's got communication, so he's contacting everybody on the ground, getting information, relaying it to other places on the Earth, and kind of he becomes this kind of like orbiting newscaster slash DJ. So he's letting everyone know what the landscape is like and who's rebuilding and what's happening here and there. And he's also giving them entertainment. So when he flies by, he can broadcast music, he can read books to people, and it becomes this really interesting side story of this guy floating around in orbit above the Earth. And you could imagine someone doing this for years. He slowly kind of starts losing his mind and other things start happening to him. Now, that's just the setup. This book gets very weird. You'll never guess where it goes. We bounce back and forth to all these different characters I mentioned. Now, Bonnie Keller, she's the lady that worked with Dr. Bloodmoney before, and she's kind of trying to help him out and protect his identity. Her infidelity kind of becomes a plot point in this one, and she ends up having a daughter named Eddie Keller. And this daughter, she ends up thinking that she has this like an invisible friend in a way, and this really becomes a major part of the plot. It gets very bizarre. You'll never guess where PKD goes with this one, and it was just a wild, entertaining ride. So if you haven't checked this one out, if you like kind of the weirder side of Philip K. Dick, you got to go find that book and give it a read. It was a lot of fun. So thanks again, Seth, for recommending that one. Keep the recommendations coming. And next up, I'm reading a classic, Starship Troopers by Robert A. Heinlein. This is a classic I hadn't read yet, so I'm be really excited to talk to everyone about that one in the next video. So just look for that one coming out next, and thanks for watching.